She whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom," into the snowstorm. Cold, forgotten, and barely alive. No one heard her cry. No one, except a retired canine named Ranger. 10 years of service, countless missions, and now one more, to save a child left to freeze beneath a slide, discarded like she was nothing. A broken soldier, a silent girl, a dog who never forgot his duty. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity, in loyalty, and in quiet miracles. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far Ranger's final mission travels. And if you believe every child deserves a second chance, and every dog deserves a forever home, hit that subscribe button. What you're about to hear will never leave your heart. The town of Aspen Hollow, Colorado, had been swallowed whole by winter. Thick snow draped every rooftop, telephone wire, and pine branch like a woolen shroud. Wind howled through the narrow mountain streets, gnawing at windows and slapping against shutters. Power lines crackled in protest. Temperatures had dropped to 10 degrees and falling, and weather alerts blinked red across every phone in town. But in a lonely cabin just beyond the tree line, where the town's last flickering streetlight gave up and the forest took over, Jake Callahan sat in silence, unaware that the storm outside was about to shift his life forever. Jake, 44, was a former Marine with the kind of presence that spoke before he did. He had a square jaw hidden beneath 3 days of beard, a deep scar along his right cheekbone, and eyes like frozen steel, calm, alert, and burdened. His tall, lean frame carried a quiet strength, but also a weariness that clung to him like smoke. He'd been out of the service for 5 years, medically retired after a mortar blast shattered his right shoulder. These days, pain pulsed through the joint like a second heartbeat. Still, he moved with purpose, rigid but grounded, like a man who knew what to do when things fell apart. He lived alone, mostly, except for the dog. Ranger lay by the fireplace, half asleep, tail twitching slightly each time a gust of wind struck the cabin walls. He was a 10-year-old German shepherd, bred for combat, trained for detection, and built like a tank. His coat was a marbled mix of coal black and warm amber, with silver streaks creeping through his muzzle and legs. His ears, one perfectly erect, the other notched from a fragment of shrapnel, were always listening. Even in sleep, he looked like he was waiting for a command. Once he'd been the best explosive detection dog in Jake's unit. They'd served together in Kandahar, Syria, Fallujah. Ranger had pulled Jake from a half-buried Humvee and shielded him during a firefight, refusing to retreat even after taking 2 rounds in his right haunch. That kind of loyalty didn't go unnoticed. When the medevac team found them, Jake had whispered through bloodied lips, "You stayed with me, like a ranger." And that was it. No one ever called him anything else again. Outside, the storm intensified, shaking the windows and sending a swirl of snow across the porch. Jake stood, walking to the window, rubbing his sore shoulder. He reached down to scratch Ranger's side when the dog sat up sharply. Alert, still, nose lifted toward the door. Jake knew that look. Something wasn't right. Ranger stood, tense but silent, his tail low, muscles tight beneath his fur. He padded toward the door and stood beside it, not barking. He never barked unless it was necessary, but waiting. Jake opened the door, and the storm greeted him like an old enemy. Wind screamed through the trees, and snow whipped sideways into the doorway, stinging his face. He saw nothing, but Ranger saw something, or heard it, or smelled it. Without hesitation, Ranger bounded down the steps and into the dark. "Ranger!" Jake called, but his voice disappeared into the gale like a stone into water. Cursing under his breath, he grabbed his boots, his heavy coat, and his flashlight. He didn't stop to think, just followed. The snow was blinding. The flashlight beam was swallowed in the white haze. Jake trudged after Ranger's fading paw prints, his legs already burning, his shoulder throbbing. Every breath stung like ice in his lungs. Ranger was moving fast, like he had a destination in mind. 15 minutes passed. Jake was soaked to the knees, teeth clenched. But he kept going, because Ranger didn't run without a reason. He spotted the dog at the edge of Ridgeline Park, a forgotten public space now buried under a foot of snow. Playground equipment sat hunched and half visible, swings frozen mid-air, a slide half buried. And at the foot of that slide, a shape. Jake's heart sank. He ran, boots crunching over ice. Ranger stood beside the figure, still and silent, not nudging, not whining, just watching. A little girl. She was curled under the slide's plastic curve like she had been trying to disappear. Her coat, thin, red, soaked through, clung to her small frame. Her hair was stuck to her cheek in frozen strands. One boot was missing. Her face, too pale, lips faintly blue. Jake dropped beside her, shaking. "Hey," he said, pulling off a glove and checking her pulse. "Hey, can you hear me?" She stirred faintly. Her eyes flickered open just long enough to meet his. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, barely audible. "I'll be good." Then she slumped back into unconsciousness. Jake blinked hard, heart hammering. He pulled her close, shielding her with his body, his coat. "You found her," he said to Ranger, his voice hoarse. "You brilliant, stubborn old dog." The girl weighed almost nothing. Jake stood, cradling her in his arms. Ranger circled once, then fell into step beside them as Jake turned toward home. They didn't speak. The snow didn't stop. But they walked, 3 survivors, toward a fire still burning in a cabin that had waited far too long for another heartbeat inside. Jake trudged through the snow, his arms wrapped protectively around the small, frozen girl. Her body was so light, so frighteningly limp, that he feared he might be too late. Ranger moved beside him, staying just ahead, glancing back every few seconds as if checking that Jake still carried their fragile cargo. The trail home felt longer now, heavier. Wind screamed through the trees like something alive. It wasn't just cold. It was a cold that reached inside and settled behind the ribs. They reached the cabin, and Jake kicked the door open with a frozen boot, ushering in a flurry of snow behind them. He laid the girl gently on the old leather couch beside the fireplace, quickly peeling off her wet coat and boots. Her lips were blue, her small hands raw and stiff from exposure. Ranger circled once, then laid himself against the couch, pressing his warm body near hers, his breath quick but steady, eyes never leaving her. Jake moved fast, tossing logs into the fire, turning the flame higher, pulling the thickest blanket from his bed. He wrapped the girl snugly, careful not to jostle her. Then he grabbed the kettle, filled it with water, and set it over the flame. As he did, his eyes fell on something in her small hand, a delicate silver necklace. The girl clutched it tightly, her knuckles white. Jake leaned in and saw the engraving. "For Ellie, love, Mom." Her name was Ellie. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Ellie," he whispered, testing it in the air. It didn't stir her. Jake stood, rubbing his aching shoulder. He stared down at the girl and then at Ranger, who hadn't moved. The dog's head was resting near Ellie's hip, one ear up, the other down, his tail curled neatly around his legs. There was something almost reverent in the way Ranger lay, like a soldier on vigil. The kettle began to whistle. Jake poured the hot water into a metal bowl, soaked a towel, and gently wiped the dirt and melted ice from Ellie's face. Up close, she looked even smaller, big eyes sunk behind exhaustion, lashes clumped from the cold, and cheeks hollowed slightly from hunger. Her coat, though child-sized, was too thin for this storm, and frayed at the sleeves. A tear on the right shoulder had been poorly stitched with red thread, like someone tried but didn't really care. She stirred slightly under the warmth. Jake crouched beside her. "Ellie," he said softly, "you're safe. I've got you." Her eyes opened just a crack. She blinked, confused. "Where's Mom?" Jake swallowed. "You're not in the snow anymore. You're inside, by the fire." Ellie didn't respond. Her head lolled slightly to the side. Then, almost instinctively, her hand sought Ranger's thick fur. She buried her fingers into his coat, and Ranger didn't flinch. Jake stood and walked to the kitchen, which was really just a counter and a stove set in one corner of the open room. He pulled a can of condensed soup from the cabinet and began heating it, glancing back every few seconds. It wasn't until the aroma of warm broth filled the air that he heard a whisper. "She's not coming." Jake turned. Ellie was staring at the flames, her voice thin as paper. Jake crossed the room slowly. "What do you mean?" Ellie didn't answer. She shifted to sit upright, still holding the blanket close to her chin, and pulled her legs under her like a small bird folding its wings. They said she would, but she never did. Jake knelt again. "Your mom?" Ellie nodded. Then, like an afterthought, she added, "That's what the necklace says, but I don't remember her." Jake's stomach knotted. He glanced at Ranger, who hadn't taken his eyes off Ellie. The dog hadn't moved an inch, except for the steady flick of his ears. "I found you under the swing set," Jake said gently. "What were you doing out there?" Ellie looked down. "It was better than inside." "Inside where?" She shrugged. "Where they put me." Jake was about to press when a knock came at the door. Sharp, 3 times. He moved quickly to answer. Standing on the porch was a woman in her late 60s, short and compact, with thick glasses and a wool coat pulled tight against her shoulders. Her name was Marion Yates, Jake's closest neighbor, though that meant she lived 2 miles down the mountain road. She was a retired school teacher with a sharp tongue and a coughed heart, and she'd taken it upon herself to check in on Jake once a month, especially during heavy weather. "Marion," Jake said, surprised, "you left the path lit. I figured something was wrong," she said, stepping in without waiting for an invitation. She was like that, direct and maternal in equal measure. Her hair was pulled back in a neat gray bun, and her cheeks were pink from the wind. And then I saw tracks headed toward the park. She stopped short when she saw Ellie on the couch. Jake closed the door behind her. "Found her under the swing." Marion's sharp eyes softened instantly. She walked to Ellie and crouched beside her, pulling off her gloves. "Sweetheart," she said gently. "What's your name?" Ellie didn't answer, but her hand gripped Ranger tighter. "That's Ellie," Jake said. "She's been out there a while, maybe hours." Marion turned back to him. "I'll get some clothes. I think I've got some from when my granddaughter visited. She's about that size." Jake nodded. "Soup's almost ready. You hungry, kiddo?" Ellie gave the faintest nod. As Marion stepped into the kitchen to help, Jake returned to the fire and knelt beside Ranger, scratching behind the dog's ear. "You never stop, do you?" he whispered. "You still think you're on duty." Ranger didn't move, but something flickered in his eyes. "Good boy," Jake said. The storm had calmed by morning, leaving behind a world of white so thick it seemed the earth had vanished beneath it. Everything in Aspen Hollow was buried under a smooth sheet of snow: roofs, fences, the mailbox down the lane. The trees wore thick coats of frost, and smoke curled softly from Jake's chimney, the only sign of warmth for miles. Inside the cabin, it was quiet except for the occasional creak of wood and the soft sound of breathing, human and canine. Ellie sat curled in a wool blanket on the edge of the couch, feet tucked beneath her and arms wrapped tightly around a small, battered notebook. It had a soft brown cover, frayed at the corners, with tiny stars sketched in pencil across the back. She hadn't let it go since she woke up, not to eat, not to sleep. Her eyes, though clearer today, were guarded, watching every movement Jake made with the quiet alertness of someone used to sudden changes. She hadn't said much since last night, only nodding or shaking her head when spoken to, but she kept that notebook clutched to her chest like it was her last piece of gravity. Jake, moving slowly because of the ache in his shoulder, handed her a mug of warm apple cider. "You don't have to talk," he said gently, settling into the armchair opposite her, "but I'll listen. Whenever you're ready." She nodded again, eyes downcast. Ranger, as always, lay beside her. The big shepherd had practically become her shadow overnight. He hadn't returned to his bed even once, choosing instead to sleep with his head resting near Ellie's legs, his breath steady and protective. When she shifted, he shifted. When she coughed, he lifted his head. Jake had never seen him bond this quickly, not even with him. Ellie's fingers moved along the edge of the notebook, hesitant, like she was debating something. Then, with a small breath, she opened it. Jake didn't move. He just watched as she flipped the pages slowly. The drawings were crude, done in pencil, some smudged from erasing, but they were unmistakably powerful. On one page was a little girl sitting alone in the snow, knees pulled to her chest. The next showed her eating at a metal table, a single plate in front of her, while in the background, shadows of laughing figures turned away. Another page showed a door, locked from the outside, and then a woman with wild, angry eyes and sharp eyebrows, mouth open in a scream. Her hands were clenched. Then came the most disturbing image, a man with no face. Just the outline of a figure looming over a staircase, one hand raised, the other holding something indiscernible. The girl in the drawing was half his size, retreating into the shadows. Jake's jaw tightened. Ellie didn't look at him. She flipped another page. This one had been drawn darker than the rest. It was a basement, a mattress on the floor, chains on the walls, crudely sketched, but unmistakable. And there, in the bottom corner, the girl again, curled up, crying, a speech bubble drawn above her. "I'll be good." Jake swallowed hard. "Ellie," he said softly, "did someone hurt you?" She didn't answer, but she didn't close the notebook either. That in itself was something. Jake stood and walked to the kitchen, pulling his phone from the shelf. His fingers hovered over the screen for a second before he scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in over a year, Nora Bennett. Nora had been a social worker for nearly 30 years before retiring early, partly due to health and partly because she couldn't watch one more kid fall through the cracks. She was tough as old leather and twice as stubborn. Jake had met her back when his cousin lost custody of his son. Nora had handled the case and left an impression. They had stayed in loose contact ever since, mostly through holiday cards and the occasional local fundraiser. He hit call. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered, "You better not be selling insurance, Jake." He smiled despite himself. "I found a girl." A pause. "Found?" "In the snow, last night. She's maybe 9, cold, scared, not saying much. But she has drawings, Nora. Dark ones." Another pause, longer. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I've got leftover oatmeal and a knitted blanket that's been waiting for someone smaller than me." Jake chuckled softly. "Still knitting?" "Better than drinking," she replied, then hung up. True to her word, 25 minutes later, Nora pulled up in her old Subaru, tires crunching over the snow-covered driveway. She stepped out, bundled in a faded green parka and carrying a Tupperware container, a thermos, and a rolled-up wool blanket under one arm. Nora was in her mid-60s, short and wiry, with cropped gray hair and round glasses perched permanently halfway down her nose. Her eyes were sharp but kind, like she saw too much of the world but still refused to give up on it. She limped slightly on her left leg, a remnant from a car crash 2 decades earlier, which she never talked about. When she entered the cabin, her eyes went straight to Ellie. The girl shrank slightly into the couch, but Ranger didn't growl. He lifted his head, watched Nora for a long moment, then rested it back down. That was good enough for Ellie. Nora moved slowly, setting the food on the table and holding the blanket out like an offering. "It's not magic," she said, "but it's soft. And no one else's germs are on it. Promise." Ellie reached for it hesitantly. Nora handed it over without forcing anything, then nodded toward the notebook, still resting in Ellie's lap. "She's been drawing," Jake said. "I figured." Nora didn't ask to see. She just sat beside Jake and poured a mug of tea. "You got a plan?" "No, just instincts."
"Well," she said, sipping, "you always were the stubborn type."
Ellie looked up, just once, and for the first time, a tiny, uncertain smile crossed her face. The snow hadn't melted, but the sky above Aspen Hollow had turned pale and dry, casting a flat silver light across the town. The cabin, half buried in frost, stood quiet at the edge of the woods, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Inside, the fire crackled low, the sound blending with the faint hiss of tea boiling on the stove. Ellie sat by the window wrapped in the same knitted blanket Nora had brought, her breath fogging the glass as she traced invisible shapes with her fingertip. Ranger, as usual, was nearby, his head resting on her lap, one paw draped protectively over her foot. Jake sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read the local paper, but his eyes kept drifting back to the girl. Something had shifted since the night before. Ellie had spoken more, not much, but enough for Jake to feel the tide slowly turning. The silence was no longer fear, it was weight, and weight could be lifted. He set the paper down and walked over. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "You okay if we talk a little?" Ellie didn't answer right away. Her finger paused against the glass. Then she gave a tiny nod. Jake crouched beside her. "Do you remember what happened before the snow?" She looked down at Ranger, as if asking for silent permission. Then, softly, she said, "My mom, her name was Grace. She died 2 years ago." Jake's chest tightened.
"She was in a car. A big truck hit her. They said it wasn't her fault, but she didn't come back."
Ellie's voice trembled.
"I waited for her. A long time."
Jake didn't interrupt. "They sent me to live with relatives. At least that's what they said. Aunt Tracy and Uncle Martin, but they weren't really family. Just said I had nowhere else to go." Her voice grew quieter. "I had to sleep in the laundry room, eat after everyone else. Sometimes they forgot. Sometimes they remembered, and that was worse." Jake clenched his jaw, but kept his voice even. Did you tell anyone? I tried, Ellie whispered. At school once, but after that, Tracy said if I ever made up lies again, she'd send me to the group home. Said nobody wants kids who talk too much. Jake sat beside her. So, you ran? Ellie nodded. She was on the phone with someone, said they'd come for me next week. I didn't want to go to a place like that. I didn't want to disappear. Jake was silent for a moment, absorbing it all. He had seen children like Ellie during his time overseas, displaced, silenced, surviving. But it was harder to see it here, in the quiet, snow-covered woods of Colorado. Somehow, it felt even crueler. He stood slowly. There's something I want to show you. He led her upstairs to the attic, the wooden stairs creaking softly beneath their weight. The attic was dusty, filled with old trunks, storage bins, and hunting gear from his father's younger days. It smelled of cedar and thyme. Jake crouched near an old filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a tangle of cords, maps, and tucked between two cassette tapes, a small black device, the kind of voice recorder used by journalists in the early 2000s. He turned it over in his hand, brushed away the dust, and pressed play. Static. Then a soft rustle, and then a voice, female, low, a little tired, but unmistakably kind. If you're hearing this, I guess something happened. And I hate that. I hate leaving like this. But, Ellie, baby, I need you to know I loved you. Every second. Every breath. Ellie froze. Jake glanced at her, saw her lips part slightly, her eyes locked on the recorder. I should have said this more. Maybe I did. I hope I did. But just in case, if anything ever happens, I left something behind. Jake Callahan, your uncle, not by blood, but by promise. He's a good man. He was there when I couldn't be. If you ever feel lost or scared, find him. He'll keep you safe. Ellie's hands trembled. She dropped to her knees, staring at the recorder like it had reached into her and pulled out something buried too long. Jake clicked it off. Grace and I were close. We met in high school. She came from a tough home, but she was tougher. She left town right after graduation, but we stayed in touch. Letters, mostly. When she had you, she sent me a picture, said your eyes were too bright to be from any world but hers. Ellie swallowed hard. She remembered me? Jake smiled. She never stopped. There was a long pause. Then, quietly, Ellie whispered, They told me she didn't care, that I was just something she left behind.
Jake shook his head. That's not true. And now, you're not alone, okay?
Below them, Ranger gave a soft whine, his way of reminding them he was listening too. Later that evening, as twilight crept across the sky and the fire once again glowed warm and steady, Ellie curled up beside Ranger on the rug. She clutched the recorder in her hands, not playing it again yet, just holding it like something sacred. Jake watched her from the table, the steam from his mug of coffee curling up between them, like a veil. Outside, frost painted delicate patterns on the windows, twisting, curling, framing the night in glassy silence. But inside, something had changed. The frost hadn't lifted, but it had cracked, just a little. The sun had just begun to bleed over the mountains when Jake noticed the tracks. Fresh tire marks cut through the snow at the edge of his property, winding down from the tree line and stopping just shy of the porch. The cabin, still cloaked in the softness of morning frost, suddenly felt exposed. Ranger stood stiff at the front window, his ears alert and tail unmoving, his entire body bristling with silent warning. Jake stepped outside, boots crunching in the thin crust of ice. A silver SUV, newer model, sat idling quietly at the edge of the drive. Its headlights were off, but inside, he could make out 3 silhouettes, 2 in the front, 1 in the back. He didn't have to guess. The driver's door opened first. A woman stepped out, tall, thin, and angular. Tracy Lawrence, mid-40s, with severe cheekbones and hair pulled back into a tight ponytail that seemed to mirror her personality. She wore a gray wool coat buttoned up to her throat and boots too clean for the snow. Her posture was rigid, like someone always prepared to argue. From the passenger side emerged her husband, Martin Lawrence, a nondescript man with thinning hair, slouched shoulders, and a blue windbreaker zipped halfway. He didn't make eye contact. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and he walked like he didn't want to be there, or anywhere. The rear passenger door opened more cautiously. A woman stepped out, younger than Jake expected. Danielle Romero, early 30s, Child Welfare Services. Petite, olive-toned, with kind eyes hidden behind sharp glasses. Her coat was government-issued, thick but shapeless, and her fingers gripped a clipboard like it was a shield. She took one look at the cabin, then at Jake, and smiled politely. "Mr. Callahan?" she asked. Jake nodded slowly. "You've got the wrong day for a visit." "We received a call from Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence last night," Danielle replied. "They stated that a minor in their care, Ellie, ran away and may be here. I'm here to confirm her safety and placement." Behind Jake, Ranger pushed the screen door open with his nose and stepped outside. The moment his paws hit the porch, his demeanor changed. He didn't lunge, didn't growl, but he stood directly in front of Jake, chest forward, tail high, eyes fixed on Tracy. Danielle took a cautious step back. "Is he—" "He's trained," Jake said, "and protective." Inside, Ellie had heard the SUV long before Jake stepped out. She sat frozen on the couch, blanket clutched around her, notebook tucked under her arm. When she saw the two familiar figures, her breath caught in her throat. Her body folded inward, and her voice went small. "I don't want to go." Ranger turned, caught her tone, and emitted a low, guttural warning bark. It wasn't aggressive, it was protective, but it shook the silence like a gunshot. Danielle blinked. "Is the child here?" "She is," Jake answered. "And she's safe. Warmer than she's been in months, I'd guess." Tracy stepped forward, voice clipped. "She belongs with us. The papers—" "Papers don't mean much if you break a child's trust," Jake cut in. "And if what Ellie drew is even half true, she shouldn't be within 100 miles of either of you." Danielle held up a hand. "I'm not here to debate. I just need to speak with the child." Jake turned. "Ellie, it's your call." Ellie stood in the doorway, barely taller than the frame. Her hands trembled, but she held her head up. "Please don't make me go," she whispered to Danielle. "I'll be good. I promise. Just don't send me back." Danielle hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Inside, Nora stood by the window, watching the exchange unfold. She wasn't the kind to pace, but her hand clenched tightly around her cell phone. She had already been working behind the scenes. While Jake had cooked Ellie's dinner, Nora had begun digging through old email chains, outdated case files, and school incident reports. She had quietly reconnected with a friend of hers, Walter Greaves, a retired family law attorney who lived 2 counties over. Walter had once handled emergency custody filings in Denver and was known for his no-nonsense approach. After reviewing Ellie's notes, Ranger's reaction, and the details Jake relayed, Walter had offered to prepare the paperwork for a court hearing immediately. Now, Nora quietly texted him a single line. "They're here." Walter responded, "Filing in 30. Tell them not to touch her." Back outside, Jake stood firm, hands relaxed at his sides. "You said you're here to confirm her safety, not remove her." Danielle nodded. "That's correct, for now. But a report has to be filed. And she has to be heard," Jake replied, "not ignored." Tracy scoffed. "She's manipulating all of you. She does this. She lies." "She's 9, Jake said coldly. "She draws chains on basement walls." Danielle's brows furrowed. "May I see those drawings?" Jake stepped aside. "Come in, but only you." Danielle nodded and followed him into the cabin, taking in the simple warmth of the place. The lit fireplace, the scent of pine and old books, the blanket still warm from Ellie's lap. Ellie sat again on the couch, Ranger lying beside her like a shadow. Danielle crouched in front of her. "Ellie, I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to know how you feel. Do you want to stay here?" Ellie's eyes welled. "He listens. Ranger listens. They don't yell here."
Danielle looked at Jake, then back at the girl. "Okay. Thank you."
Outside, the wind picked up again, and the SUV hummed gently on idle. Martin lit a cigarette but turned away from the porch, as if ashamed to look back. Danielle exited a few minutes later, clipboard tucked under her arm. "We'll schedule a hearing. Her voice will be heard this time." Jake nodded once. "Good." As the SUV pulled away, Ranger finally relaxed. Ellie reached out and placed her hand gently between his ears. "Good boy," she whispered. And for the first time that morning, Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. The Aspen Hollow Municipal Courthouse was a modest building, a relic from the 1960s with cracked red brick walls, narrow frosted windows, and a wooden bench outside that creaked under the weight of time and snow. On this gray morning, the steps were swept clean, but the cold still lingered in the air like a held breath. Inside, the courtroom was small but formal, high ceilings, polished oak trim, and rows of pew-like benches. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and cold paper. Ellie sat quietly at the long wooden table, her legs dangling above the floor, her hands tightly gripping the edges of her notebook. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set with a determination that hadn't been there even a week ago. Her hair was brushed and pulled back into a simple braid. She wore a navy blue dress borrowed from Nora and corduroy tights to keep her warm. Beside her sat Jake, dressed in his only suit, a dark gray set he hadn't worn since his father's funeral. And across from them, Ranger lay stretched out calmly, his head resting between his paws. He didn't move, didn't bark. But his eyes tracked every shift, every whisper, like a sentinel. The judge entered quietly from the side door. Judge Marion Collingsworth, late 60s, dignified and firm, wore her silver hair in a tight bun and glasses that hung from a delicate gold chain. Her presence was steady, not harsh, but immovable, like a mountain that had seen too many winters. Her eyes scanned the room before she spoke, her voice even and low. This court is now in session. We're here to determine the temporary custody placement of minor Eleanor Grace Dawson, following concerns of neglect and mistreatment while in the guardianship of Tracy and Martin Lawrence. Jake glanced at Ellie, gave her a subtle nod. She held tighter to her notebook. The first to speak was Tracy Lawrence, her tone clipped and confident. She wore a sleek black suit with a red scarf, her posture upright and rehearsed. She described Ellie as troubled, prone to lying, and emotionally unstable. She claimed Ellie fabricated stories to gain attention and had behavioral issues that were increasingly dangerous. Martin sat beside her, silent, eyes cast toward the floor. When Ellie was called to speak, the courtroom fell into a hush. She stepped forward slowly, clutching her notebook like a lifeline. Ranger rose with her and sat beside the witness stand without being asked, his body brushing gently against her leg. Judge Collingsworth raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Ellie's voice, when it came, was soft but clear. I tried to be good. I did what they said, but it never mattered. She opened her notebook and placed it on the table. They made me sleep in the laundry room. I wasn't allowed to eat with the family. If I spilled anything, I didn't get to eat at all. Sometimes they locked me outside, once all night. I said I was cold, and they told me I should have thought about that before talking back. She looked up, eyes shining. I didn't talk back. I just asked if I could eat early once. Jake clenched his fists under the table. Did you ever tell anyone? The judge asked. I tried. At school, I told the counselor, but then she called Tracy. After that, they told me I couldn't go on the field trip, said I was making up stories. Then, a surprising voice spoke from the audience bench. I lied. All heads turned toward a girl, around 10 years old, with sandy blonde hair and freckles across her nose. She wore a gray hoodie and pink sneakers, and she stood shakily beside the aisle. Her name was Sophie, Tracy's adoptive daughter. Judge Collingsworth peered over her glasses. Would you like to say something, young lady? Sophie nodded, trembling. I said Ellie broke my toy, but she didn't. I did. I was scared my mom would get mad. And she did, but only at Ellie. Tracy stood, her face blanching. Sophie? Enough, the judge snapped.
Sophie took a deep breath. Ellie didn't lie. I did. She never yelled. She just stayed quiet.
Judge Collingsworth leaned back in her chair, her eyes grave. Thank you, Sophie. You may sit. As murmurs rippled through the room, Jake stepped forward and handed the court clerk a small envelope. Your Honor, he said, I'd also like to submit 2 documents. First, a DNA test confirming that I am the biological maternal uncle of Eleanor Grace Dawson. The judge reviewed it, nodding slowly. The second, Jake continued, is an audio recording left by Grace Dawson before her death. In it, she names me as Ellie's intended guardian, should anything happen to her. The judge accepted the flash drive and directed the bailiff to play it aloud. Grace's voice filled the room, soft, tired, but filled with warmth. It spoke of love, fear, and the desire to protect Ellie from a system that often failed children like her. Ellie's eyes brimmed with tears as she listened, and even Judge Collingsworth looked away for a moment, adjusting her glasses. When the room fell silent again, Judge Collingsworth folded her hands. This court recognizes the credible testimony of Eleanor Grace Dawson, the corroborating statement from Miss Sophie Lawrence, and the supporting evidence submitted by Mr. Callahan. Effective immediately, temporary custody of Eleanor Grace Dawson is granted to Jacob Callahan, pending further investigation and a final custody hearing. She turned to Ellie. You have shown bravery beyond your years. Thank you for telling the truth, even when it was hard.
Ellie nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for listening.
Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow, dusting the courthouse steps in white. Jake placed his coat over Ellie's shoulders and guided her out the door. Ranger walked beside them, tail wagging once, just once, as if to say, mission complete for now. The air over Aspen Hollow had changed, not in temperature, but in weight. The sharp edge of winter had dulled into something gentler. Snow still covered the hills and rooftops, but it no longer seemed to press down like a burden. Instead, it softened the world, made things quiet in a way that didn't feel lonely. At the cabin tucked deep in the pine woods, smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, and laughter, real laughter, floated out from the windows. Inside, Ellie stood at the kitchen table, a crayon clutched in one hand, tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth in concentration. Before her lay a wide sheet of drawing paper, the corners already curling from her breath. In the picture, she'd drawn the cabin with thick brown lines, smoke rising from the chimney like cotton candy. On one side stood Jake, tall, square-shouldered, with his signature flannel shirt and a big smile. On the other side was Ranger, drawn larger than life, his ears upright, tail curled like a question mark. Between them stood Ellie herself, smiling wide, her arms stretched toward both. Jake walked past, balancing a power drill in one hand and a weathered plank of cedar in the other. His jeans were dusted in sawdust, and a pencil was tucked behind his ear. His shoulder still ached most mornings, but these days the pain had a purpose. He stopped behind Ellie, looked at the drawing, and smiled. You forgot the porch light, he teased. Ellie smirked and quickly added a little yellow dot above the door. Ranger lay nearby, sprawled comfortably on a thick quilt next to the wood stove. His breathing had slowed these past few weeks, and sometimes his right leg twitched with stiffness. He no longer leapt up at every sound. His body moved slower, but his eyes never missed a thing. Jake had noticed the way he hesitated on the steps and had decided to fix that. Out front, just beneath the snow-covered eaves, he'd begun building a wide, low wooden ramp. It wasn't fancy, just sturdy boards, traction strips, and railings, but it allowed Ranger to walk freely in and out of the cabin without pain. Ellie had named it the Hero's Bridge and written it in bright chalk letters on the top plank. Later that afternoon, Nora Bennett arrived carrying a box of hand-knit scarves and gloves. Nora, as always, wore a faded denim jacket over a wool sweater with a thick green scarf she'd crocheted herself years ago. Her hair was pinned back with a pencil, and her boots were as worn as the trail she walked on. Age hadn't slowed her down, it had simply made her more efficient. She'd seen too much pain in her life to waste time with pleasantries, but that didn't stop her from baking banana bread every Sunday and slipping extra marshmallows into Ellie's cocoa when she thought no one was looking. Is that ramp finished yet? She asked, arching a brow at Jake as she stepped through the door. Mostly, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Ranger tried it this morning, gave me the look of approval. Good, Nora said. You'll need another one in the back soon. That old dog still guards the rear like it's a war zone. Ranger gave a lazy tail thump from his quilt. Over dinner, they finalized the structure of the new project. Safe Steps, a small outreach effort inspired by Ellie's journey. The name had come from a line Ellie had whispered one night, half asleep on the couch. If there's a place where you can take safe steps again, that's where I want to live. The name stuck. With Nora's experience in social work, Jake's handiness and land, and Ellie's perspective as someone who had survived, the three of them had everything they needed to start small. Just a few rooms in the cabin at first. Spare beds, warm meals, quiet corners for kids like Ellie who had nowhere to go and no one left to trust. They'd fix up the old tool shed into a second sleeping space, with Ranger's ramp design as the blueprint for everything. Nora contacted a few retired caseworkers and nurses she'd known over the years. Jake began mapping out a schedule. Ellie created the first logo, hand-drawn, in crayon, a house with 3 figures, a winding trail, and a paw print over the door. That night, under the soft hum of the wood stove, Ellie curled up next to Ranger, sketchbook in hand. She'd stopped drawing shadows. Now she filled page after page with forests, cabins, stars, and people who smiled. Ranger was in almost every picture. Jake watched from the armchair, a warm mug in his hand. He'd never imagined this kind of peace, never believed in anything permanent after the war, after his injuries, after the world had burned through so many of his plans. But somehow, here, with a girl who once whispered apologies into the snow, and a dog who still guarded her like a soldier, he'd found something closer to home than anything he'd known before. And when the paperwork had arrived that morning, official, notarized, final, it made it all real. Eleanor Grace Callahan, a new name for a new beginning. Outside, snow drifted down again, not heavy or cruel this time, but soft as a sigh. And in the warmth of the cabin, with crayons scattered across the floor and the scent of cinnamon lingering in the air, the world, for once, felt just right. The snow that morning was soft, falling in lazy spirals over the rooftops of Aspen Hollow like confetti from the sky. A pale light filtered through the pines surrounding Jake's cabin, casting a silver glow on the world below. Everything was still, the kind of quiet that only happens after healing. Inside the cabin, however, the stillness had taken on a weight no one had expected. Ellie was the first to notice. She had woken early, still in her pajamas, flannel ones with little stars on them, and tiptoed past the creaky floorboard near the stove to where Ranger usually slept. But this morning, he didn't lift his head, didn't flick an ear. He lay curled tightly, his breath so faint it took her a few seconds to realize it was even there. "Ranger?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. His coat, usually warm beneath her hand, felt too cool. "Ranger, wake up!" Nothing. Her voice broke. "Please!" Jake came running at the sound of her sobs. His heart stopped when he saw Ranger unmoving, Ellie clinging to him with both arms, her small shoulders heaving with silent cries. "He's not moving," she gasped. "He was fine last night. He was—" Jake knelt down beside them. He placed his hand gently on Ranger's ribs. There, faint but present, a shallow rise and fall, still breathing, but barely. "He's alive," Jake said, though his own throat was dry. "But we need help, now." By the time Jake had wrapped Ranger in 2 thick blankets and carried him to the truck, Ellie was already dialing Dr. Molly Evers, the town's veterinarian. Molly had known Ranger since Jake first brought him back from deployment. In her early 40s, Molly was the kind of woman who moved with quiet purpose. She had short red hair always pulled into a loose bun, freckles across her cheeks, and hands that were rarely still. She lived above her clinic and picked up the phone on the first ring. "Bring him in," she said without asking anything else. "I'll be waiting." The drive through the snow was agonizing. Ellie sat in the back seat with Ranger's head in her lap, whispering soft, broken words into his ear. Stories, apologies, promises. "You're my hero," she said at one point, her fingers buried deep in his thick fur. "You don't get to leave before your birthday. I planned everything." When they reached the clinic, Molly met them at the door. She took one look at Ranger, her face tightening, and guided them into the back room. Machines beeped softly as she placed sensors on his chest and set up an IV. After a long silence, she looked up. He's exhausted, pure collapse. His joints are inflamed. His muscles are locking up. Probably from the cold, the arthritis, and just age. But he's a fighter, Jake. If he makes it through today, he'll pull through. Jake nodded, jaw clenched. Ellie just held Ranger's paw. That afternoon, word spread. The cabin had become a symbol in town. People knew what Jake and Nora were building there with safe steps, and Ranger had become something of a quiet legend. The dog who found a girl in a snowstorm. The dog who sat through court hearings like a statue. The dog who, no matter the weather, always watched the back trail while Ellie slept. By evening, neighbors began arriving at the cabin. Sarah Dunham, a retired school nurse with silver hair always tied back in a scarf, brought soup. Tall and slender, with a warm voice and a no-nonsense attitude, Sarah had tended to dozens of children over the years, but said Ellie reminded her most of her own niece who had survived a similar storm of silence. Bill Yates, the gruff hardware store owner who rarely spoke unless it was about tools, brought a set of padded floor mats for Ranger to rest on, claiming leftover stock, though Jake knew better. Even Sheriff Anson, a broad-shouldered man with a stern brow and a hidden soft spot for dogs, dropped off firewood and asked awkwardly, "How's the old soldier?" By nightfall, the cabin glowed not just with firelight, but with presence. People sat in the kitchen, on the steps, by the window. No one spoke loudly. Everyone waited. And then, sometime just past midnight, Ranger opened one eye. A soft whimper escaped him as he tried to lift his head, and Ellie, who had fallen asleep beside him, stirred. She blinked once, then bolted upright. "Jake! Jake! He's awake!" Jake, who'd been dozing by the fireplace, rushed to her side. Ranger's eyes, though glassy, were focused. His tail gave a faint thump. "He made it," Jake said, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. 3 days later, the sun came out fully for the first time in weeks. The snow sparkled under its light, and birds could be heard again, distant, cautious, but real. Ellie stood by the porch, tying a ribbon around a wooden post. Balloons bobbed in the breeze, blue, white, and gold. A hand-painted sign read, "Happy 11th Birthday, Ranger," in big, bold letters with paw prints drawn beside the text. Inside, the cabin had been decorated with simple streamers, hand-cut stars from construction paper, and a banner Ellie had made with Nora that read, "To our hero who listens even in silence." Ranger lay in his usual spot, front legs stretched, wearing a paper birthday hat that kept sliding off his ears. He didn't seem to mind. Children, 3 of them now staying temporarily at safe steps, stood nearby, each holding a tiny cupcake. They had come from different places, different stories, but each had found warmth here. One boy, maybe 10, knelt beside Ranger and whispered, "Thank you for finding her." As the party began, Ellie placed one more thing outside, a wooden plaque Jake had helped her carve. They hung it just above the porch. It read, in careful hand-painted letters, "Here, all whispers are heard." Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not loud or sudden. They come quietly, wrapped in snowflakes and silence, in the steady breath of a dog who refuses to give up, or in the fragile voice of a child who dares to hope again. Ranger didn't just rescue Ellie from the cold. He brought her into the warmth of belonging. And Jake, scarred by war, found healing not through medicine, but through love, purpose, and faith. This story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, God is near. He sends help in unexpected forms: a retired soldier, a loyal German shepherd, a kind neighbor, a simple wooden ramp. These are not coincidences. These are divine threads, woven by a God who hears every whisper, even the ones spoken through tears. If you're going through something heavy, if you feel unseen or unheard, remember, you matter, your voice matters, and you are never truly alone. Share this story with someone who still believes in second chances. Leave a comment below and tell us, who is the Ranger in your life? If this touched your heart, give it a like. Hit subscribe to follow more stories of hope, healing, and miracles. And if you believe God still works through people, animals, and moments like these, type amen in the comments, and may the Lord bless and protect you and those you love.